Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to all of our Global Chamber members and guests for joining us for the first part of our three-part Globinar series focused on doing business across Australia, Japan, and the United Kingdom. My name is Katie Keith, and I'm the Executive Director for the Global Chamber here in London, and I'm joined by Kirsty Wilkinson, Executive Director for the Global Chamber in London. Good evening to you, Kirsty, in Melbourne.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Katie.
Kirsty and I have been doing a lot of work over the past 3 months or so, talking about the opportunities to bring our three nations together. And with the announcement of the free trade agreement between Australia and the United Kingdom, coupled with the moving forward of the UK with the comprehensive and progressive agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which does include countries such as Australia, Japan, Canada, and Singapore, it has never been more important for global business leaders to understand the deeper driving forces of trading successfully with each other. So over the next month, we're going to be focused on this three-part series looking at business culture, trade opportunities, the pitfalls and opportunities that are available to us, and we'll talk more about these agreements in detail there. And then the last event is going to bring all of our panelists together in conversation, opportunities for you to all network with each other and actually bring it to life and start doing business with each other. And today is quite special because we're going to be really focusing in on that business culture and how important it is. Having grown up in Australia and moved to the United Kingdom about 5 years ago, I thought it was going to be smooth sailing. No problem, I'm going to be working for an Australian company. It's all the same, but it wasn't. It was quite challenging. And I still to this day am learning so much more about the culture here. And so today I'm joined by our expert panelists who are delighted to be here. They're excited about sharing their valuable insights on how we can do business better and build up our cultural education. So welcome to Victoria Reynoldson, English Communication and Culture Coach, founder and director for Perfect Cover English. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you.
And welcome to Dominic Carter, who's Representative Director and CEO at the Carter Group. Welcome, Dominic. Hello.
Thank you.
And Haruna McWilliams, welcome to you, Head of Accounts at Tokyo Esk. It's great to have you on the call today.
Thank you for having me.
And Kirsty Wilkinson, our Executive Director for the Global Chamber in Melbourne and also founder at Asia Market Makers. Hi, Kirsty.
Thanks for having me, Katie.
Thank you and welcome to you all. And today I just wanted to start by learning a bit more about you. So I'm going to go around to each of you and just talk a little bit more about who you are, what you do and how you're adding value in this space. And also we're going to then build on that and understand what are the importance, share some more things about the culture. So for example, Victoria, I'd like to start with you. Share a little bit more about yourself and the work you're doing.
Sure, absolutely. So hello, everybody. Lovely to see you today. I'm Victoria Reynoldson. I'm based in London, the UK. And as Katie kindly introduced me, I'm an English communication and culture coach. So what I do is I work with international execs and also with HR teams who are supporting their international talent and relocating employees to the UK. And specifically, what I'm doing is I'm helping people with English communication confidence. So thinking about how to be really effective in their specific business situations to really communicate well and build great conversations that give results. From a British cultural confidence point of view, I'm helping people understand what drives British culture. How do British people do business? And that's really important in terms of building the relationships, making sure that we are influencing well with British teams and ultimately also delivering great results in terms of business and trade. So that's a little bit about me in terms of what I do.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And could you share a bit more about what really defines British culture? Because a lot of people have, there's common misconceptions, I know. And I think from a business perspective, if I'm sitting, in my office in Japan right now or in Australia, and I'm thinking, you know what, I'd really like to expand my operations or do more business with other companies, what would that look like for them?
So this is a really big question. And I think it's, if I kind of like perhaps touch on a number of different themes, really top line to start with, I think there are a number of things which are really interesting. And the thing that you mentioned about actually we live in this very globalized world and we often use English as the language of business. And therefore we assume that because people are using English, we understand each other. That is actually a little bit of a misconception. And clearly the way that culture works regionally means that people operate in different ways. They behave in different ways, they communicate in different ways. So bringing it to the sort of British cultural context for business, I think there are a number of particular areas to think about. One is about individuality. So that expresses itself in a couple of ways. I think there's a real sense of people wanting to be individuals and express their individual personalities, and that's very accepted. But also the focus on individual goals and achievements. Actually, yes, the team matters, but there's also that focus on actually what I'm doing, my ambition, my goals, and the results that I deliver. Another theme perhaps is about respect. And I think respect has very different definitions according to culture. In British culture, I think that means a little bit about respect for the individual. And that kind of means that we're very, British culture generally is quite open, quite multicultural, and quite accepting of different cultures and different ways of working. There's also something that clients tell me, which is sometimes British teams are quite hard to get to know. Individuals are hard to get to know. There's almost that sort of personal distance and almost a sense sometimes that British people are a bit private and that they'll only give you so much surface level information, which can be difficult in terms of building relationships and doing business. But it also comes across from a respect point of view in the sort of disagreement style and how we give negative feedback. And this is a really fascinating point from the three cultures we're talking about today, because relatively, probably from an Australian perspective, the British may be experienced as a bit indirect and a little bit sort of like not saying exactly what they mean. But actually, from a Japanese perspective, that might be different. Actually, British might be more direct in style than perhaps the Japanese norm, potentially. So there are different angles on this. And the very last thing, which I'll touch on very briefly, is about British humour. And this is a huge topic in itself, but the humour works in a very specific way, I think, in the UK. And that is something that I spend time helping people understand and understand how to navigate as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting, some of the things you brought to life there, and I've actually experienced them. And we actually have a couple of Aussies on the call today who have lived across these three countries, and Haria as well is living in Amsterdam at the moment as well. So that I'm looking forward to learning more from the other guys on those thoughts. But expanding on that, what would you say, what would be your top tips then for people who are thinking about living, working here, moving their business operations here?
Absolutely. So I think, again, you know, there is lots and lots to kind of unpack here, but very sort of top line, some particular tips touching the themes I already kind of shared. I think there's definitely a sense of, you know, making sure that there is a sort of focus on what the kind of goal is, making sure that the plan is delivering, particularly giving short-term wins, and perhaps not having too much of a rigid plan. I think the British culture means that people want to have some flexibility. There doesn't need to be a sort of mapped out full plan with no risks. Actually, there is quite high risk appetite in the UK, and there's a real love for practical creativity, practical innovation. And I almost like to describe it as imperfect action. You know, people want to be able to make things happen, even if the plan is only like 60 to 80% kind of scoped out. I think the other thing is about, I touched on this point about disagreement and indirect sort of feedback style when there's a negative message. I think this can be hard to sort of decipher sometimes. I, you know, help people understand those techniques and the types of language that people might use. So if I'm really specific here, some examples might be the way that the word sorry is used, which isn't just an apology. It has many, many different shades of meaning, from I'm confused, I'm interrupting you, I'm disagreeing with you. So that is quite fascinating to understand that. But my tip is, that if people working with British teams and they feel like they're not getting, not really understanding what's going on, what is the intended meaning behind the words, then to clarify. And I know that might sound like a very simple tip, but it's sometimes in the moment, almost sometimes people try and accept things as they are rather than actually really clarifying and probing and just saying, can I just check what I really understand kind of where we are at? And that is absolutely fine to do. So I think that, is a tip. And then socially, one last kind of idea here is that, the British sometimes are hard to get to know, but the important key to this is to know that that getting to know process doesn't happen within the workplace. It happens outside. So the pub is a really key place. You know what, these days, I think it's perfectly acceptable not to drink alcohol. It's not that you have to do this, but it is really important to go and have a social experience with the team you're trying to influence in the pub. Whether that's Thursday night drinks, Friday lunchtime, kind of going for a meal, even small things like going off-site to have a coffee together or going to fetch a sandwich and stand in the sandwich queue together. These little moments are the moments where British people are a bit more open and willing to kind of share a bit more about themselves personally. So yeah, there you go. Just a few very top line tips about sort of how to be effective.
They're very, very strong tips. And I'm resonating with them as you're going through them, thinking that was how I broke down my cultural barriers, educating them and being educated by them. And I think that was really important. And I think with COVID, it really has redefined the way we work. So looking for those opportunities to go out and build relationships is quite key. So we're going to have to get creative, aren't we?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the thing, it doesn't have to be about physical spaces. Here in London right now, things are starting to open up again, but particularly if you've got a virtual relationship or actually if the situation changes, I think there are creative ways that we can still connect in an online space and do that level of socializing. There were lots of creative ideas that were happening amongst teams, back in when we had more of the kind of lockdown times here in the UK.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you very much, Victoria. I'd now like to move across to Japan now, and we've got Dominique Carter who's joined us. Dominique, could you take a few minutes just to share more about yourself and the work you're doing?
Sure. Well, I'm from Australia. As I'm in good company, I think, today. I came to Japan more than 21 years ago, so almost 22 years ago. And I was actually working for a British company in Australia who sent me to Japan to open up their office in market research industry. And so I've been basically running market research companies the whole time. Like my own company I opened up in 2004. So we've been going for quite some time now. The work that we do is mainly with international clients. So there's a mix of clients that are outside of the market and clients that are in the market. So we work with some large American international companies in Japan, mainly on their sort of innovation pipeline. So the types of research we do are sort of more appropriate to innovation style of research, so qualitative research, and so forth. For clients that are outside of Japan, we'll do everything from soup to nuts in terms of getting them up to speed with how their category works, what their perceived strengths and weaknesses are likely to be in Japan, how their consumer works, what things do they need to be aware of in terms of elements of their offering and strategy that they're going to need to change when they come into the market, because it's very rare that someone comes into Japan and doesn't need to change something. And it can be very difficult for companies that are otherwise successful in international markets to hear that they need to do something differently in Japan. And there are a lot of reasons why that's difficult. It may simply be hard to accept because they've had the experience in being successful. Otherwise, sometimes it's just hard to change, or sometimes it's really just expensive and it just requires too much. They'll accept that things need to be done differently here, but they not really able to make the investment. So we'll work with companies, they may know nothing about the market, or they may have already launched here and they just need to fine tune, or things need to be adapted, and so on and so forth. So we have a very wide range of projects that we take on, but at the moment, very prominent in our mix of business is aging technology, which is super, super interesting. And an area where Japan really is leading the world. It's actually the world's largest market for aging technology, and in digital entertainment. So all forms of digital. This could be streaming platforms for drama and so forth, but video game, immersive entertainment, theme parks, all of this kind of thing is also a very big area for us. So yeah, that's a short.
Sounds really interesting, actually. So there's a real element of technology in what you do and the types of people you're working with. But you mentioned something really important there. When other businesses are coming in, like American companies coming into Japan, do you get a lot of pushback from them? Is there ways that you work with them to understand how they need to change?
I think it's very, very important if you can spend quality time with the people who really are the decision makers in the home market. And you don't always get that opportunity. Sometimes you get the opportunity. I mean, we took the entire executive board of a major American company around Tokyo in a van to like little Shotengai, little shopping streets, and crazy little places in Tokyo. And we came across a Shinto shrine, and like we were like going along that, and then the priest came out and said, "Do you want to come and see my omikoshi?" which is like the when you have the matsuri, it's the thing that they pull out. And so like it was just amazing kind of random experience, but very, 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 very important that the most senior people who are really going to be signing off on the investment in Japan are actually able to spend time in hopefully, like it's unrealistic to say an unhurried fashion for senior executives, but to sort of give it the time to be properly immersed and to meet different types of people. And I think that really makes a difference to their ability to change.
So being able to be there and experience it is quite an important factor.
I think so. And I think you also need, to some extent, a little bit of help to understand what it is that you're actually looking at or what you're experiencing. So you can, one thing that you'll see very consistently when you move across cultures is people will observe the same thing but have a different interpretation on it. So it's not to say that someone's interpretation is correct or incorrect. It's just to say that there may be more than one way of understanding what just happened in that meeting, or what that person really meant when they were talking about that topic. I mean, like Victoria, to what you were talking to, I mean, I would say we have this idea of high context culture and low context culture. So like Britain is I guess is a more high context culture than Australia, even though Australia and Britain are actually pretty close culturally. And America, of course, is like on another sort of level of low context, where you really need to be clear in terms of what it is that you're trying to say to people who are Americans. Like I've fallen in this trap living in Japan, where I've felt that I'm sending very clear signals to the other side in a business negotiation. Whereas like if you were Japanese, it would be so obvious what I meant, or it would be so obvious that I'm unhappy with you. Like you wouldn't, but because I'm sort of living in this very high context culture, I fail to verbalize a lot. So you're living in a culture where people don't verbalize. So, well, how do you deal with that? That's actually very difficult. You've got to ask people, what happened? What just happened in that meeting? Like, were they happy or were they unhappy? Are they going to cooperate or are they not going to cooperate? Did I say the wrong thing, or did they like me? You know, all of that kind of stuff. You know, in our own culture, we don't have to ask those questions. We know. But so yeah, that can make it quite challenging, actually. And I don't think you should assume that you know.
That's a really good point, actually, Dominic. Thank you for sharing that story, because I think a lot of the time we do make assumptions, and I think that is something we need to remove from the table. Never assume that the other party is on the same page as you. Good top
Yes.
there. And I just wanted to go in a bit further here and just talk about what defines the Japanese culture for you as an Australian going in, living and working in Japan. I think you're in Izu at the moment, are you?
Yeah. Yes, yeah. So on the coast.
Yeah, and what would you say defines the Japanese culture for you doing business there?
So I think that I don't know if people are old enough to remember Bill Clinton's presidential campaign, but he famously the line was, "It's the economy, stupid," right? In Japan, it's the trust, stupid, right? Like nothing happens if people don't trust you. And that's an absolute. It's an absolute. If people do not trust you, there will be no transaction occurring. This can be in a business to business situation. This can be in a B2C context as well. So your actions, like the first actions you need to take in your strategy, are building trust. And people generally don't understand that piece because it's not as important in the home country, but it is absolutely essential. So I think trust is one. I think different approach to time is another. I think we need to understand that Japanese and Westerners at least have very different, or let's say Anglo-Saxon cultures have different perceptions of time. Like for example, like very simple example is in the days when we used to work in offices, in Australia, we'd come in at 8:30 in the morning and leave at 5 o'clock. And like there'd be no one in the office. Like there'd be a weirdo in the office, like maybe at 5:30. There'd be a couple of weirdos maybe. But like that's it, they're gone. But Japan is like, oh, you know, people will come in 10:30, 11, midday, is not unusual. But we'll work until like 9, 10, 11, midnight. It's very hard to tell someone who worked till midnight that they have to come in at 8:30 the next morning. So that kind of hard ending on our day just doesn't really exist in Japan. So that takes a bit of time to understand. Oh, okay, so you know, the perceived time that I have to complete a task in, the perceived time that I have, you know, and basically things are slower in Japan. So you have to be prepared for any return on your investment to be slower, any return on an email, like that's the big picture ROI, like basically just reduce your expectations, right, in terms of the timing of the payback, but everything's slower. Response to email, time between meetings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that perception of time is really critical as well. And then just because I needed another tea, I'll just say like the need for tenacity, right? So it's a little bit more than patience is required. So you've got to have time to build trust. And you know, you really can't give up. And to me, I think in business culture in Japan, I think they're the things that jump out at me.
The 3 T's.
Yeah.
Trust, time and tenacity. Thanks, Dominic. That's really interesting. I'd like to now move along to across the pond, down under, and speak to my colleague Kirsty Wilkinson about doing business in Australia. And also Kirsty specialises in Japanese culture as well. So it'd be really interesting, Kirsty, to hear more about you over the next few minutes about what you do. So over to you, Kirsty.
Oh, thank you. From a very early age, I did a lot of travelling, even as a child. I lived in Indonesia. My dad was working for a Canadian engineering company. And then as an exchange student, when I was at high school, I went to Japan on an AFS BHP corporate scholarship. And I've been back to Japan a lot of times through my study and now work. I actually help companies interested in entering the Japanese market or that there might be Japanese companies interested in coming to Australia. I think one of the things that I really focus on is mindset, because I find a lot of Australian companies think they know it all. They think that because they've been successful in the UK, Singapore, or other countries, that they'll be successful in Japan. Wrong. You have to often take them back a bit and say to them, you may have done that in a certain way in such a country, but the way things are done in Japan is very different. And very much what Dominique was saying, things take much more time, and that's what I actually say to people. And I think that actually puts people off because it takes more time. And I remember one potential client that came to me was interested in exporting to Japan, but they were too patient in a hurry. And it's very true what Dominique was saying about trust. I was referred a client who had a product in some of the convenience stores in Japan. And unfortunately, their product got contaminated. And after that, you only get one chance in Japan. So after that, he had no chance. And I tried to explain that to him, but he seemed to wanted to fix it. But I said to him, unfortunately, you only get one chance. So trust is incredibly important. And after that, no one trusted him. So I've spent more than 20 years also teaching Japanese to both high school students and also adults as well. And I really enjoyed teaching culture as well. And I don't think you can actually learn a language properly without learning the culture as well. So I think that's really important. Yeah, and I've also lived in the UK as well. So I've lived across the 3 countries, and they're all very different. It's funny because I actually feel more at home in the UK and Japan than I actually do in Australia, because I often find that Australians are too direct and too forward in their thinking.
Oh, thank you, Kirsty. I think that's really fascinating that you've been across the whole 3 countries and learning the language and really immersing yourself. Can you share with us a little bit more about what really defines the Australian culture for people wanting to do more business with us in Australia?
I think the thing is, each state and territory is very, very different. And I'm sure Dominique could attest to this as well. I've lived in Western Australia. I was actually born in South Australia, and I've lived in Melbourne for most of my life. And Melbourne and Sydney tend to be more multicultural, and you tend to get more different types of food. So it's easier to get, say, Japanese food, Indonesian food, Indian food, all sorts of things that you can get. I think also people are a bit more open-minded, a bit more flexible, whereas in places like perhaps rural Queensland, rural Western Australia, they're probably not as open-minded because they haven't had, for example, a lot of people from overseas visit where they're living. So I think that does certainly play a role. But I think one thing I actually learned when I was in Japan, I had one of my mentors say to me, she said, it's not right or wrong, it's just different. So when Dominique was, talking before, I could really relate to what he was saying. And I think, and I know that in the first 6 months, I really struggled when I was in Japan, but one of the things that helped me get over the cross-cultural differences was that, it's not right or wrong, it's just different, and it's just a different way of thinking, doing things. So I think that's really important. And one of the things that I've really noticed, especially with the vaccine rollout, has been the issues that we've faced in some parts of Melbourne. For example, there are some parts of Melbourne where there are a lot of Muslims, and for a long time they were very reluctant to getting COVID vaccines. But once community leaders had actually gone in there and actually explained the importance of having those vaccines, the vaccine take-up has been much better. And I think you noticed that. And then there are certainly in Melbourne, there are pockets where there might be, like, for example, Lygon Street is known for having, it's mostly run by Italians. And then there are other parts of Melbourne where there might be, Vietnamese, for example. So so everywhere is very different, but I think the key is, if you just be, polite wherever you go. Learning some English obviously is important, and English is our business language. So I think that's really important too. And often it's good just to listen to what people say first, and then take that on board, and then make your own mind up. So
thanks, Kirsty. Honestly, it's right. It's not right or wrong. It's just different. How true is that? And I can see everyone shaking their heads when you were saying that. And I think, being Australian myself, we're such a multicultural nation, but very much English speaking. So it is important to know that you're probably only going to get one language from most people. But that open honesty and that sort of, open for a hug type attitude, I think is quite important. So, as someone who has lived and worked across all three countries, I think that's a really important insight to share. It's not right or wrong, it's just different. So thank you. I'd now like to move over to Amsterdam. We've got Haruna McWilliams joining us, who works for a Japanese company in Amsterdam with multiple offices around the world. And you're from Japan yourself, aren't you, Haruna?
Yes, I am. Thanks for the introduction, Katie. So slightly similar to Kirsty, who just spoke about her experience. I was born in Japan, raised in Japan until I was 11. And then I actually moved over to the Netherlands. So I'm actually a returnee to the Netherlands. And it's very interesting coming back after 20 plus years, because I do see where my thinking and the way I approach work as well as life comes from. And it's actually the Dutch culture. And now I understand, to Dominique's point earlier, when I went back to Japan as an 18-year-old, as a freshman in college, why people are telling me that I was aggressive, because I was quite straightforward. My Japanese wasn't fluent at the time, even though my parents are Japanese. I went to international school. And it took at least a couple of years for me to relearn Japanese and relearn Japanese culture. So I had a major counterculture shock, I remember, going back. Simple things like people not saying hello to you when you walk into a shop, people just pushing you on the packed trains in the morning. I'm sure everybody's seen the picture, and not saying excuse me or anything like this. That was shock to me at first. Now, having been in Japan as an adult for a good amount of time, and also worked in the UK, US, and then for the last 5 years before moving to Amsterdam in Singapore, and then coming back to the Netherlands, I really do see everything that's been said already about how cultures are different, how you should approach different cultures. And I couldn't agree more about the point on never assume. And this is even true within one culture, because cultures evolve. And so one of the things I was thinking about is that even for my own culture, which is, I would say, Japanese as well as Dutch culture, they do change. So it's a never-ending learning for everyone, I believe. And one of the things that's an issue in the Japanese business culture now in Japan is the discrepancy or the gap between the 20s and the 40s. So imagine your manager being 40-something-year-old and you're 20 or maybe early 30s coming into the workforce a few years in. Those two generations have the hardest time communicating, because I'm obviously the older generation. I come from a generation where it was very difficult to find a job. I come from the ice age, as it was called, of job hunting in Japan. Although my route into getting a job was very different, once again, because I came back from overseas. And so I could take another route to get a job. Now, the 20s, they've seen our generation go through hardship, work, like it's been already said, 16-hour days. And they don't want to do that anymore. They don't see the point. And this also goes down to a point about diversity, for instance. They look at women of my generation and say, thank you, but no thank you. I don't want to work that hard. I don't want to sacrifice my family, sacrifice my relationship to be working this way. And the 40 plus generation need to understand this. And they have their own new ways of doing business. They have their own new ideas. And we really should be open. And I think the same goes for learning about different cultures. Never assume, never take anything for granted. And that's the biggest learning that I've had in my career as well as my life.
Very interesting. It's not just about the culture, is it? There's layers to this. It's, you know, it's generational as well. And the history of the nation, which has formed the way people think and the way people approach life in general, really.
Exactly. So now I'm in Amsterdam for a lot of different reasons. But it's very interesting to be working at Tokyo Esk, which is a company that I work at, where it is similar to Dominic. We do market research, but our uniqueness is really leveraging the cultural differences to grow our clients' businesses. And you don't really think about cultural differences when you first start your business in another market, but it's very, very key to your success, even from the get-go. Take a simple thing like a word clean, for instance. Cleaning, you look it up in a dictionary, you might get several definitions for it in every language, I'm sure. However, when you say clean in Japanese, and let's take an example of something like house cleaning or even cleaning yourself, body care. In Japan, cleaning comes with gentleness and care. Whereas when in the past, I worked with American companies where clean meant power and really taking the dirty things, the bad things away. And that's how Americans see clean. When they bring this concept to Japan and say, let's say this toothbrush cleans everything, plaque, germs, everything completely, and they think this is a good thing, Japanese people might take a step back and say, actually, that might be dangerous to my skin, to my environment. There's a famous painkiller in Japan called Bufferin, which has a tagline, and it's been a tagline as long as I can remember, so over 4 decades, of half of Bufferin is made of gentleness. So even though it's a painkiller, it talks about gentleness. And it's gentle to your stomach, because people know that some painkillers are harsh on your stomach. And if you don't know that, coming into the Japanese market, simple proposition like cleanliness could mean completely different things. And that's where we focus on when we do market research, to find how we can really position your product and services in Japan in the way that resonates for the Japanese people.
Interesting. Just one word can really change the face of how it's received in a different country as well. And so the marketing across countries, so it's one thing to develop relationships, but then it's how you perceive your brand in a market as well, which is another part of doing business and another part of understanding the culture and what's important to your audience. Because you're going into a new audience, you're on a new stage and you're doing a new performance. So it is about how do you communicate with them. And based on all the work, experience that you've had working across multiple regions, would you be able to share some insight on what's been most impactful for you and any challenges you may have overcome having moved across from Japan over to Amsterdam and having gone back and forth?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So once again, first and foremost, never assume. So go into any situation with an open mind. Try to put yourself in the other person's shoe. So some of the topics that already came up, for instance, trust. If you flip that around, when a Japanese company or Japanese key decision maker says to you, we are interested in your business, we are interested in working with you, that actually means probably 99% they're confident to do business with you, which means they have done a lot of groundwork before they get to this point, because they need to have that trust in order to do business. And over here, when somebody says, I want to do business with you, whether it's a Dutch company or sometimes even, British companies, EU companies, what have you, they might not know whether they actually want to do business yet. So coming with a Japanese perspective into this situation, you're also thrown back a little bit, because you say to yourself, but this business said they are interested. What happened? Why aren't they serious about this? Whereas when a Japanese company says it, it might take months on months before this company says, yes, I will do business with you. But once they do say that, that's pretty much a go ahead and a very heavy, serious thing for them to say. And we need to understand this. So a lot of companies come to us and say, can you find importers in Japan for our products? And yes, we can. That's the short answer. However, be prepared. It will take time. And just as much as the Japanese side, the ones importing are going to be doing a ton of research about you and your category in your market, you should also prepare yourself to do a lot of research about them. Because the worst thing is coming to a meeting and not knowing about them or their history, because that already loses some respect and trust from them. So how to build trust is very, very different in each culture.
Yeah, trust has come up a lot across the three countries, really, because it is about that mutual respect and trust that you have for one another. And I think that comes from learning and educating yourself on what that culture looks like. And I wanted just to say thank you for all of our panelists for sharing more about, what does culture mean for you? What are some of the insights? Just to read out a couple of comments from our audience before we go into some more questions. Bin Ray has said, this is a very interesting conversation about different communication styles and can be received by others receiving the communication. So thank you, Bin Ray, for that comment. Manuela Simonetti, question for Haruna. How do you tell a Japanese company that you will not do business with them in a gentle and respectful way if you do not want to raise expectation? That's a good question. Thanks, Manuela.
Yeah, sure. First of all, I'm sorry to say this, but the question came up as a Jap company. Let's not use Jap. That's a derogatory term, just so you know. So let's use Japanese company. I know you were in a hurry, probably. That's okay. To answer your question, a lot of people still use that word, so just wanted to put that out there. Just to answer your question, you probably won't hear from them, because I'm sure Dominique, Kirsty, you can agree, Japanese people don't like confrontation in the way that the Westerners do. And I'm very much generalizing here because we heard the differences between British and Australians earlier. So you probably won't hear from them, and you probably won't get a clear no written down or even articulated from them. So if they're saying things such as, well, maybe in the future, when our paths cross, we may do business together, that might be a way for them to say no. But you really have to read between the lines on this one, and you will feel it because there's no progress being made. And that's when you know they're not interested. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything.
I think also it's very clear when you're dealing with a Japanese person and you say something is difficult, they understand it means it's impossible. And there are, like, thinking about non-confrontational ways are a bit surprising. I remember once I had a client, I think you know this client too, Haruna. We had a client and in different agencies, but they asked for this like an enormous discount over the entire business. And I read the email and I was like, no, I don't like that. I'm not gonna, so I just ignored it. I just pretended I never read it. Like, it was, I know that sounds like really weird, but like, it's almost like the fact that I didn't respond was actually enough to communicate that this is really a problem. And so then it gives everybody time. As I said, time's important. Gives everyone time. They've got time to understand it's difficult for me. I've got time to work out some sort of response. And like, literally the topic came up 3 months later. So that's just a very, very different timeline than what people are used to dealing with, I think, in Western business. But so there are things that you can do that you'd never do in a Western business setting, but you know, sort of just a very different context here.
And Dominic,
Yeah.
just to elaborate on that question from Manuela, how would you say no to Japanese company, like in response to, like, if I was setting up a business and I thought, this doesn't look very good to me, like, how do I do it in a way that's
I'd slow it down, but Japanese don't say no, right? They don't say, when a Japanese says no, they really mean no. Like, it's a very, very kind of like,
definitive.
tough.
That's it.
Yeah. It's like a hard no. That's like a no. That's like, get out of here. But people say yes, and they don't necessarily mean yes. And like, I don't know how long I've lived here, long time. I still fall for it in terms of misinterpreting. Yeah. Whereas like where the other side is trying to be in rapport with me, they're not necessarily agreeing with me, but they're interested enough to kind of, maintain that dialogue. And that's how in that moment we're going to maintain the dialogue, is by me, saying yes to you. So if I was saying no to somebody, I'd probably tend to slow down the communication, and probably just come up with, generally speaking, Japanese people come up with excuses or minor objections or minor problems. And like, if you're having like an interaction with a Japanese counterparty, if there's a lot of small objections that come up, that can be a sign that there just really is a lack of alignment here, and it's sort of a bit of a signal to back off sometimes. So like, you've got to get comfortable in Westerners with not having closure, right? We want closure on stuff. I've said to people that work for me in the past, it's like, why don't you just tell me what you're thinking? Like just tell me, are you happy? Like, just what's wrong, or like, but it's just not, you can't, like, it's very, very hard for people to have that direct communication with you. And people will communicate through their actions, through their lack of action. So you need to really be very attentive to just those sort of cues in action and inaction, and speaking and not speaking. I think that you gotta, it helps probably to have a Japanese person on your side too, who can help you sort of interpret that, because you could be getting it totally wrong too. So yeah.
I would also say that I think when Dominic talks about excuse, that also can come across from things like making it about the group. So it was a consensus decision. It's out of my hands. It's not up to me, but the company or your boss decided it was a difficult situation to pursue, something like this.
I have a difficult situation at the moment with a client, and the way that they describe it is something just happened. Like, something they did, something they definitely did, but it just happened. And so, and then we understand that actually on our side, that the best approach that we would take, even though we're not very happy with the situation, is a positive one, and one that maintains rapport and maintains relationship and so forth. And you sort of get, but if you're in a Western, sorry to be so mysterious, but like, if you were in a Western setting, you'd be much more aggressive. Like, you'd definitely have, even though of course here's a supplier, here's a client, but you would have, there'd be a much more clear context for a conflict there. But it's not the way to play it in Japan. Conflict is never productive here. So yeah.
And I think that I wanted to throw over to Victoria for a minute, because there's something developing here around the word no, and then I'll go to Kirsty as well for your thoughts. But no means so many different things, and there's ways to say it. So in Japan, it doesn't get said. There is so much encompassing around that. And I get a sense of, Victoria, I would like to hear your thoughts on how that plays out here in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just kind of reflecting on that. So what's really interesting is in the UK, you might hear yes, actually, but actually it's not being said in that way. So what you might hear is a very positive message like, oh, wow, interesting, or a great idea, or I hear where you're coming from. But, and that's the bit you need to pay attention to. So the construction of the language and the communication is, there's a positive message, the but comes, or the however, and then the real message is landing. And it's often expressed in a quite a hesitant, quiet way, almost as a question. One of the interesting techniques I noticed somebody sort of using was, can I make a suggestion? Which sounds very hesitant, like you're asking permission to feed back. But I've heard it used in a way, in a British way, to be quite directional and say there was actually a lot wrong with the idea and actually a lot needed to change. So I think the British angle on no is sort of actually a positive message and then the negative message really landing. When it comes to actually really saying no, I think the other thing that happens is that there is not so much a like for confrontation as well in the UK. So it might not be said in the meeting. There might be a bit of, okay, well, we'll think about it and we'll kind of, yeah, we may need to have another meeting. And actually some of that no may come later on email in writing, because that's seen as more distant, less personal, less to the point. But also, I just want to kind of say, picking up on a point from earlier about, I think we were saying about how culture is evolving. Clearly, culture isn't a static concept. So when I talk about the British, clearly that is just an average, a norm. And we have to be really careful about stereotypes here as well. So clearly, the British that are in London, the UK, are very different from, say, Edinburgh, Scotland. There are regional differences, there are sector differences, there are company differences. So that's part of, also the work that I do, is helping understand not only the national norm, even though the UK is a small place compared to, say, Australia or the US or some other countries, it's a really small place, but there are lots of nuances within that as well.
Very important. Thank you very much, Victoria. Kirsty, do you have any thoughts on this dynamic?
One of the things that I think is really interesting, having lived across the 3 countries, is when I first came back to Australia from Japan, I had reverse culture shock. So I actually found that I found Australians very brash and very forward, too direct, and I didn't want to hug anyone. In Japan, people tend not to, hug one another, they'll bow and so forth, those kinds of things, but, they tend not to, hug one another. And I actually didn't want to hug friends or even family. And initially my mum especially was really put out by that. And, she was very offended. And I explained to her that it's nothing to do with her. It's just, the cultural differences between Japan and Australia. So I notice now as well, when I'm doing business or even communicating with friends, I often find that I tend to say things more subtly, and not saying them so directly. And I think that's from my experience living in London, and also having lived in Japan, and having a lot of interactions with Japan, and also other countries as well. But yeah, I think it's something that's really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just say something too?
Yeah.
I mean, like, following up from what you're saying there, Kirsty, it's like in Japan, like, people, when you say something, what people think is, what did he really mean? Like, so I could say the sky is blue today, and they'll be thinking, what does he mean? Like, does he mean that he'd like to come for a walk with me? Or you know what I mean? Like, there's people are adding on meaning to what you're saying. So we might feel, even when we say something very directly to someone in Japan, you could be very direct. Like, I just told you exactly what my requirement was at this point in time, or what my feeling is right now, or whatever. But then they don't respond in the way that you think they're going to respond, because they're actually thinking, what did Dom really mean? And they're responding to what they think I meant rather than what I actually said. So this is where you'll find in I have the experience of not being direct enough with Americans, but
Mm.
where I'll say things to Japanese and it's way too direct, and then you get into trouble.
Yeah, exactly. I've had that experience. Yeah, definitely. Where I've been talking to an American and I'll say it the way I would normally say it, and then they don't understand it all. And I know I've had conversations with some of the management of the Global Chamber about this, and yeah, it's sometimes that they don't know what you're talking about. So sometimes you have to explain what you actually mean.
Yeah, you have to have different personalities. People have told me that I have a completely different personality in Japan, speaking in Japanese versus over here speaking in English, for sure.
I've heard that, and I totally agree with that as well. Yeah.
You have to be a bit of a chameleon, don't you? You have to be able to wear different hats at different times. I think that's the art of it. And as we sort of come up to our last 5 minutes of the discussion, I just wanted to say my head is bursting with all these amazing insights, and I could keep talking to you guys for hours on this topic. And I think we're only scratching the surface when it comes to really understanding what we need to know about other business cultures and other people's personal cultures, really. We do have one more question. I'm just going to throw it out there. May Slawinski has asked, has the dynamic changed now in terms of building relationships in the age of COVID? Have virtual meetups become more popular now in Japan? So that's a good question, because we touched on this earlier, and I think this is a classic example of how we're communicating via a virtual platform. But do you have anything you'd like to add on that?
It's definitely changed out of necessity, but I would like to emphasize this phrase, out of necessity. So this change didn't come naturally or willingly even to some people. They had no other choice but to use this kind of video conferencing tool. So what I see, it's still the remnants of the Japanese business culture being reflected on the screen every single day. For instance, when you do a workshop, when I run workshops, and let's say that there are some senior members of the company and the junior members of the company. Now, some of them even have the cameras off. So unless you ask them and make it a mandatory to turn off the camera, not everybody will turn the camera on. And people have different reasons. You know, maybe they're a bit embarrassed about how messy their house is, the kids running around, what have you. But they're quite comfortable in their anonymity as much as possible. So unlike what was said about the UK, about individualism, it's really about anonymity, about the group. And that's one of the reasons, for instance, even in digital, a platform or tool like Twitter skyrocketed, because you can use an anonymous name. You don't have to use your own name to say what you mean. So in the workshop, it's always the senior people who talk first. And then one by one, they say what they're supposed to say, let's say, in their position. And this is a very traditional Japanese company I'm talking about. So instead of workshopping and exchanging ideas, free-flowing, you really need to give workshop a structure and give people permission to say, this is a free 10 minutes where you can say, regardless of your position, what you feel about the subject. Even then, you probably have a hard time extracting everybody's opinions. So it's a transition. And yes, we are using the same tool, whether it's Zoom or what have you, but the culture is still there. And it's what you do with the tool. So for instance, using the hand raising tool function on, so that not everybody has to say what they mean verbally, using quizzes, so that you can extract information that they won't proactively say. You really do have to try as a facilitator to overcome that culture still.
Could I just add also to your point, Haruna, about generations, because I think the whole generational thing's really, really important at the moment in Japan. But I think the way that these virtual tools are being used is quite different generationally. So they're sort of almost, for people in their 20s, are almost a little bit subversive, because they're obviously able to see the amount of nonsense that can be cut through by being able to communicate this way. And then I think older generations are just trying to replicate the way that the way that it already is. But I think that the rise of like COVID, I think, has accelerated potentially accelerated these trends in changing world of work and so forth. And I think the generational impact is kind of quite important, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do have to remember that the key decision makers tend to be the older people in Japan.
Yeah.
So that's definitely something you have to consider when you're using even digital tools.
That was a really good way to end our panel discussion today, guys. I think that topic around virtual culture is so critical. And I think we're going to be seeing more and more of that over the coming years as we continue to connect with one another via these platforms and do business. And I just wanted to close off today by saying a very big thank you to Victoria, Haruna, Dominic and Kirsty. Your insights today have been amazing. I think everybody who's joined us on the call today, thank you for your comments, your questions. We do have our next part of the series coming up on the 27th of October. We're going to be unpacking the opportunities for trading with one another. We're going to be tying in these business cultural aspects. And in our third part of the series, you can actually access the link now in our chat bar. We will be bringing everybody back from today and from the next session with an open networking opportunity, so we can actually bring these opportunities to life and do a bit of business along the way. And for those of you who are new to Global Chamber, we are a unique in over 190 countries with business leaders around the world looking to focus on acceleration of international trade and investment opportunities. We're pretty much everywhere. Please join us. We look forward to working with you. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you, goodbye, and enjoy the rest of your evening, morning, or day. Thanks, guys.